Hi there, and welcome to my third video looking at Alex O'Connor, CosmicSkeptic's conversation with William Lane Craig with regard to the Kalam Cosmological Argument. I left it at the end of the last video with Craig coming to some kind of realization of the argument that Alex O'Connor was putting forward with regard to conceptual nominalism, something that I have long espoused, and Craig conceding that it was consistent without really refuting it or arguing with it. He did sort of attempt to laugh it off, but then said he had reformulated the Kalam cosmological argument to be stated as follows.
Now there, I think that's a mistake, Alex.
Okay.
I have actually reformulated the Kalam cosmological argument to make it more modest by rephrasing the first premise in the following way. If the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. Second premise, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. So that statement of the argument would be fully in line with mereological nihilism. If the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. Or if the fundamental particles began to exist, then they have a cause, et cetera, et cetera. So it would just mean that it's not begging the question. It would just mean that you couldn't use the sort of inductive argument that I appealed to.
Quite right. As you point out in your series about objections and about the objection of circularity in particular, you say, well, arguments don't beg the question, people beg the question, right?
Yeah.
And so I would agree with you that if you reformulate the Kalam, or even if you keep it in the original form but use a different justification, you're not begging the question. My essay was just trying to make the point that if you justify it in that inductive manner, it seems to me that you're begging the question.
Well, I'll agree with you that the inductive argument wouldn't work if you have this kind of mereological nihilism. And then I would fall back on the two metaphysical arguments, which for me are the most important, as opposed to the inductive argument.
So this is Dr. Craig reformulating the Kalam cosmological argument in light of the criticisms of those who propose, I would say, conceptual nominalism. He phrases it in terms of mereological nihilism. That is, that nothing begins to exist, it's just a transformation of pre-existing material or energy. And I was trying to find out on some of his sort of website and writings where he talks about this reformulation. It's quite difficult because it seems to be fairly recent. There is this bit of writing which I'll link in the description below. And he does admit, quote, now, admittedly, if mereological nihilism were true, then we'd have no clear example of things beginning to exist. At least in everyday experience. There remains the question of fundamental particles beginning to exist which are not composed but are simple. So my inductive argument from experience that things which begin to exist have causes would not have force for the mereological nihilist because those things don't really exist. Mais n'importe, it's not important, since mereological nihilism is not a reasonable option, which is a very, very interesting position, and one that he hinted at in the video itself, which is to say that, you know what, if you adhere to mereological nihilism, then that's consistent and it makes the first premise, everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence, impotent, right? So what he's saying is basically conceptual nominalism, which is massively what I subscribe to, works as a criticism against the KCA. And he says, but that's not important because I've reformulated it. But he doesn't really put any arguments forward other than incredulity, as I mentioned before, and indeed in this piece of writing, that he says it's not a reasonable position as a bare assertion, and I think he needs to do an awful lot more work to dismantle conceptual nominalism in light of the Kalam cosmological argument, because what he then has is a reformulation which requires a lot more argument for. So just to remind you, and I'll quote from the writing rather than show you some of the video that I showed you before, he says, and again this is from the same article, but then do I beg the question in claiming that the causal premise is still true even if the mereological nihilist is correct, that there are no composite objects? No, because the inductive argument was but one of my three arguments in support of the causal premise, the first two being metaphysical arguments that are unaffected by the assertion that there are no composite objects, namely that, this is the first argument, something cannot come into being from nothing, and that, here's the second one, if things could come into being from nothing, then it is inexplicable why anything and everything does not come into being from nothing. So, given mereological nihilism, the causal premise is not a mere presupposition, but is supported by arguments which the skeptic must address. This is fascinating. So basically he's saying there is now absolutely no inductive defense of the first premise of the Kalam cosmological argument. And as I pointed out in my book on the KCA, which will be linked below, as I pointed out in that, the first premise, everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence, is an inductive conclusion. So I think by him accepting that you can't get to that first premise by induction is a massive concession. But then he says, but hang on, I've got two metaphysical arguments that defend the first premise of the Kalam, namely that something cannot come into being from nothing. Again, this is a mere assertion and something which he gets around for with God by saying that God is necessary. Well, then I would argue, if you can say that God is necessary, then matter can be necessary and the universe can be necessary. And then he says, it is inexplicable why anything and everything does not come into being from nothing. And this is an interesting position that one can answer with arguments such as, well, a kind of skeptical atheism rather than skeptical theism, which is to say that just because we don't know how something comes about, we can't say that it doesn't come about. So the fact that we don't know why not anything and everything is possible doesn't mean that it isn't the case that this is so. That would be the first one. And then you can get onto sort of more technical arguments. I've argued in an essay called The Argument from Format, why causal determinism is the only coherent ontology of the universe, because if you don't have law-like behavior on matter, you just wouldn't get anything. You would just get chaos, and the fact that we don't have chaos means that the fact that anything can exist meaningfully is precisely because you have law-like behavior of all matter. Now that can get a bit more technical to argue for and against, and probably won't be something for now. But the point of this is the fact that those two metaphysical arguments that he presents now to defend the first premise, which is a reformulated premise in light of mereological nihilism or conceptual nominalism, those two metaphysical arguments are bold, bare assertions. So almost in conclusion now of the Kalam cosmological argument, and having put in a huge amount of work and effort into this book some years ago, I suppose I was going to say, well, what's the point now, because he's reformulated it. But in fact, it is this argument and the arguments herein that I think have forced him to reformulate his Kalam Cosmological Argument, which is a huge concession for him to make, because this was one of the pillars of his debates and arguments for the existence of God, and then on to the Christian version of God. So actually, do you know what? Job done. And now I think it's up to Craig to really establish the metaphysical basis for those two arguments, or the basis for those two metaphysical arguments that he proposes to defend the first premise of the KCA. I think he's got a lot of work to do to establish those, and the concession that the KCA in its reformulated state is a far more modest argument is a massive concession. I think this is a huge victory for Alex to get him to admit this, and for work like mine in showing some of the many weaknesses with the Kalam Cosmological Argument.
So the kind of other justification that you might give, and the one that I found really interesting, was saying if things can come into existence out of nothing, that is, if you deny the first premise, then why doesn't it happen all the time, right? Why don't things begin to exist out of nothing all the time? Now, my first thought was to say, how do we know that they don't, right? Because to come into being out of nothing would surely imply coming into existence not within the universe, because everything in the universe is not nothing, as we've said. And so to come into being out of nothing, it would have to somehow come into being outside of the universe, and therefore we wouldn't observe it. So maybe it is happening all the time, but we wouldn't be able to observe it by definition.
Yeah. Here, I think you're making the same mistake that we talked about earlier when you spoke of the horse coming into being in the living room.
Yeah.
Thinking that therefore it's not out of nothing. And what I explained there was that I'm saying without an efficient cause. That's what I mean by out of nothing. So if things could come into being without an efficient cause, it seems inexplicable why things aren't just popping into existence all around us, things of different sorts, because they don't need efficient causes to bring them into being. This was an argument that A.N. Pryor developed, and I found it just completely convincing.
So let me how can I put this? A horse. How about an argument like this? Now, I've heard what I think might be this kind of line of argumentation from you before, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. So if someone were to say something like, and it seems absurd on the surface, but if they said something like, well, what if it's the case that universes are the only thing which can come into being out of nothing, right? A horse can't come into being out of nothing, but there's something about the universe. And we already know that the universe is a special kind of something compared to everything within the universe. It seems to kind of have, we need to think about it in a different way.
Yeah.
Could we not say something like, well, maybe things do come into being all the time, except the only thing that can come into being out of nothing is a universe, and therefore we wouldn't be able to observe it?
As A.N. Pryor said, prior to its existence, the universe doesn't exist so as to constrain what can come into being or not. So you can't say that only things of a certain kind can come into being without efficient causes, because without their causes, there just isn't anything to constrain it. So I don't think that you can say that only certain kinds of things can come into being without efficient causes.
Yeah, now the argument that I didn't want to put it in your mouth was one that I've heard elsewhere. People would say the argument that the reason you can't say that only universes can come into being out of nothing is because nothing doesn't have any properties, and so therefore can't have a kind of preference for universes over other things.
Yeah.
My response to that was to say, what if the necessity of it being a universe is not a property of the nothing, but a property of the thing? And let me explain myself. For example, if we human beings create a circle, it has to be round, right? We can't create a square circle.
Right.
But that's not due to a property of us. That's due to a property of the circle, right?
Yeah.
So in the same way, although nothing has no properties and so can't prefer universes, what if it can only... What if only universes can come from nothing because of a property of the universe, not because of a property of nothing?
Right. That is exactly what you would have to say, because
Yeah.
as you say, properties only inhere in existing things. Beings have properties, not non-being. So you'd have to say it's an inherent property of the universe that it can spring into existence without a cause. And I just can't make sense of that.
Which sounds absurd.
Something that doesn't exist come into existence without a cause because it has a property after it comes into existence.
Yeah,
I mean,
it sounds strange, but the reason why I think it's useful to think in those terms, or at least of the possibility of it happening, is because specifically the objection that why don't things pop into existence all the time? I suppose what I'm trying to do is make at least a far-fetched case. I'm trying to show at least a possibility that things could come into existence out of nothing, and yet by definition, we'd be incapable of witnessing it. So maybe things do come into existence out of nothing all the time, but because these are only universes, we'll never be able to observe it, we'll never be able to see it.
This is definitely an interesting interchange between the two. I don't think Craig has particularly grasped the fact or the idea that Alex was partly trying to get forward, which is that... And probably best explained by just saying there could be a scenario where everything feasible, possible, whatever exists. So everything has popped into existence. So, and it's difficult because the word universe we use to be local, our localized universe. But you can imagine things popping into being outside of our universe. Does that make it a universe? No. Outside of our worldverse or whatever. Outside of our localized universe, you could have things popping into being all the time and you just wouldn't know. You just wouldn't know. We have no access to anything outside of our localized universe. So, Craig, to assert that, why don't things just pop into existence all the time? We don't know that they're not. The other point that I think Alex is bringing up is some kind of a priori necessity for certain properties. So this might be something like logic. If you have the basic fundamental tenets of logic or whatever system of logic that you think could be a priori, could be a kind of necessary existence in all possible worlds, law of non-contradiction, whatever. Perhaps by setting out these building blocks at the beginning that are necessary in every possible world, if existence as a whole throws out everything popping into existence all the time, those everythings must be bound by some axiomatic, self-evident truths at the bottom, a priori truths, perhaps logic, perhaps, and then if you say, well, if logic is necessary, then perhaps this idea of mathematics is necessary, and then possibly if that idea of mathematics is necessary, then this idea of physics is necessary. Do you know, you could propose certain arguments that result from a priori axioms that lead you to certain constrained forms of existence that pop into being out of nothing. So perhaps everything exists, but that everything is only certain things or have certain constraints on them. So you would get universes that look like this one. And that's not even talking about like the many worlds interpretation of quantum. So I think there's just an awful lot that can be said concerning those two metaphysical arguments that Craig proposes to soundly defend his Kalam Cosmological Argument as reformulated.
Let me commend you for your method, Alex, because by pushing these questions, what you help the atheist to see is the intellectual price tag.
Yes.
No. It's utterly reasonable. there is no intellectual price tag of conceptual nominalism. Not only is it evident in the world around us in why we argue about everything, from what a hero is to when a human starts, when personhood starts, and what morality is. We argue about all of these things all the time, precisely because conceptual nominalism or mereological nihilism pertains, right, or maintains. So it's not a price tag at all. It's, to me, it just is, right, and it's obvious, and it's actually hugely coherent. In fact, the intellectual price tag is one that's paid for by Craig and his arguments, and trying to argue for some kind of Platonic realism, trying to establish now these metaphysical arguments to defend his Kalam Cosmological Argument. No, you do not concede that to Craig. I'm sorry, because then what he does is he starts the listener to this, or the watcher of this debate, this conversation, then thinks just naturally and intuitively, oh, that's an unreasonable position. I'm more comfortable sitting with Craig. Craig, he's some clever dude, and he's incredulous about this position, so it must be nonsense. No, this is a rhetorical technique. This is a disingenuous technique, and I'm not a fan of it, and this is Craig at his worst, right? I think Alex has done a phenomenal job, but in then doing that job, he allows Craig to get away with a few things, and he allows Craig a bit too much respect, and then admits, oh yeah, I know this is a radical view. No, it's not a radical view. No. So not a fan of this section of Craig really getting away with making some bold assertions and then falling back on his incredulous approach to mereological nihilism,
of his atheism. And I think that's very valuable. One of the goals of the Christian apologist will be to try to raise the intellectual price tag of non-belief. And if non-belief or non-theism requires me to be a mereological nihilist,
And here again, I just criticise Alex a little bit by him laughing along and nodding at that point to Craig is tacit admission that Craig is right. Okay, and it's little things like this which I think are hugely important, especially for those lurkers who watch things like this and aren't really sure about the arguments either way. And then they see this and they go, yeah, Alex is sort of laughing along, admitting that his position is ridiculous, and Craig is basically, I've got this intuition that Craig is right. No, and I think that little bits of body language like that are dangerous in what is essentially should be a very rational argument, either deductive or inductive, or both. But it shouldn't be about Craig's incredulity being agreed upon, which I think is kind of what happens there. So I would be sat there going, no, Craig, it's not a huge price tag. The price tag is all yours. And you need to explain very clearly now why I have such a high price tag when I can show you how coherent my worldview is and how it fits in empirically with everything that we see around us in the description of how humans go about their daily lives in talking about things and arguing about things.
Think that things have an intrinsic property, that they can come into being, that other things don't have. This is all raising the intellectual price tag of non-belief. For me, at least, Alex, just way beyond what I'm willing to pay. And so that's helpful that you're doing this.
That is a really, really interesting way of thinking about apologetics, and the argument that we're having is kind of like, what's the better deal here, right? Because both worldviews seem at least consistent, but you've got to ask yourself, how much you're willing to sacrifice of your intuitions, how much you're willing to sacrifice of the beliefs that you think are true in order to hold to those conclusions. And the key point is taking the justifications that we're giving and showing what they lead to, right? Because a lot of people consider, well, this argument may allow this to be the case, but they don't think that if you accept that justification, it can also lead over here, and you don't want that, right? And so I think this discussion has demonstrated that every time you think of a justification for a point you're trying to raise, you have to consider the implications of that justification and the other areas of philosophy it causes you to
Absolutely
sacrifice. That's a really, really fascinating way of thinking about it. And I think it's a great place to end.
Yes, I think that is a really good place to end, but also a really good summary of apologetics and counter-apologetics, which is, after all is said and done, by adhering to a given conclusion, what is the most reasonable and what do you lose most by adhering to one or the other? So I would actually conclude that Craig, and like I've just said before, Craig actually has a much higher price tag, because he needs to establish Platonic realism, or some kind of realism whereby these ideas of that being a table, that being a chair, that being a hero exist out there in some kind of ether, right? Where and that is just a really, really tough gig. That's a tough one to sell, because that's what underwrites his refutation of mereological nihilism, that these things have existed and always existed. It's like saying, well, you've existed in some form since the Jurassic period because all of your composite parts existed, etc., or whatever. When of course that's not what someone like myself would be saying, which is that all your parts exist in some form, and when they come together in some kind of network, other people who are conceptual entities look at that thing and go, oh, I can see this, I conceive this thing. So some people look at me and say, I can conceive this entity called Jonathan Pierce, and then that entity goes throughout life and then dies. But actually, what began to exist? When did Jonathan Pierce begin to exist, and when did he finish? And who is right about what Jonathan Pierce is? And there are lots of very interesting arguments within that. And how does personality and personhood, not personality, how does identity exist over time? This is a very, very famous philosophical argument, which apparently Craig just goes, this is crazy. You crazy atheists, go and argue about that. But actually, no one really agrees, or there's no consensus agreement on how identity of a human changes over time, especially since all of your constituent parts change, your memory changes, your personality changes, depending on your genetic structure and your biology and your environment. And so there is this changing entity over time that we attach a label to and say, well, that's Jonathan Pierce over time. But actually, there are huge amounts of philosophy and argumentation to have concerning those, and that's probably one of the most complex ones. But simple things like chairs, that chair hasn't existed since time immemorial, but its constituent parts have existed arguably since the Big Bang. So but it hasn't been a chair for that long. So when did it begin to exist? And I might disagree with the next person, and someone else might not even agree that it is a chair, because actually it looks a bit more like something else or whatever. So, like I've said, these are huge problems that are really coherent for someone like me, and understandable, given that we are as humans conceiving entities that attach our own meaning and conceptions upon everything that we see and everything that we interact with. So not only is there a demand for Craig to defend this idea of a Platonic realm of abstract ideas, but also when it comes to something like defending the human identity over time, he will say something like the soul, and the soul has phenomenal amounts of problems. So he is the one with the higher price tag, because he needs to show how a soul is coherent, how Platonic realism is coherent, amongst a number of things. So no, I think that's a great summary from Alex, but I think that actually the kind of burden of price, if you like, is far greater for William Lane Craig than it is for an atheist like myself. Just before I leave you, I want to talk a little bit about something that happened earlier in the discussion, and just have a little discussion about God existing in a timeless scenario causally prior to creating the universe, and the difficulty this poses for ideas of God, for personhood, for freely choosing, for deliberating, and so on and so forth. Let me just prep you up with what they discussed.
Well, here it's so easy to be tricked by language.
Right.
And I think what we have to say is that God is timeless sans creation and in time subsequent to creation. And that is a non-contradictory way of stating it.
Is that non-contradictory? Because the way I'm thinking of it is God sans creation is timeless. And so God kind of exists eternally as a timeless being, but somehow in the same breath exists as a temporal being as well. So is temporal and non-temporal?
There is no time. Sans creation, this is a timeless, spaceless existence, and time and space come into being at the moment of creation, which I would identify for the sake of simplicity with the Big Bang, with t equals 0, the first moment of time.
Sure. So when we talk about, so it doesn't make sense to talk about God creating the universe at a point in time, right? The reason I think this is important is because I know it's not strictly the conclusion of the Kalam, or maybe you think it is, but I've heard you talk in the past about how once we identify that there's a cause to the universe, we can say that it's a personal cause, let's say,
Yes.
because of the fact, and I may be misunderstanding here, but my interpretation was that it has to kind of do something to create a universe, right? And if an infinite being creates a finite thing, that doesn't seem to make sense unless the infinite being can change its nature in some sense. But how can we understand this outside of the idea of time, right? Because when I first heard that kind of line of thought, I was thinking, well, are we saying that there's an infinitely existing being who, because at some point in time creates the universe, something must change, and therefore it must be a kind of conscious decision-making cause? Without time, I don't see how that jump can be made.
I wouldn't express it exactly the way you did, but I think that you're in the ballpark. The problem here is, how do you get a cause with a how do you get an effect with a beginning from a cause which is permanent?
Yes.
If the cause is truly sufficient for its effect, then if the cause is there permanently, the effect ought to be there permanently. How in the world do you have a permanent cause, but an effect that only begins to exist a finite time ago? And it seems to me that the best answer to that question is that the cause is a personal agent endowed with free will, because free will can initiate new effects without antecedent determining conditions. And so what I would say is that this timelessly existing free agent freely wills to create the universe, and therefore time comes into being at that moment, and this being enters into time at that moment.
Holy cow. Okay, so his answer to a timeless creation quandary is the fact that God just in this immutable state of timeless existence and perfection, one would argue, can freely choose to do something. Now, my opinion has always been that Craig damn well needs to be challenged on free will, because I think free will is the weakness of basically every single Christian apologist and thinker's thesis in the world, because libertarian free will doesn't work, right? It's philosophically untenable, it's empirically untenable, and it's necessary for the existence of a judgmental God in pretty much all senses of the understanding of God. Okay, so free will is your big one, and Craig, if I was to debate Craig, I would just go in on that. I would debate him on free will, because without libertarian free will, you don't get a judgmental God unless you're a Calvinist. It's hugely important. And here he is proposing an already incoherent idea to defend timeless creation, right? So you don't have time, in which case you don't have deliberation. There's no thought process going from one moment to the next. There's no wondering about anything. There's no thinking, oh, I wonder if this is... There literally is an instance, a timeless instance, if you like, and creation. So God can't freely choose. In what sense of the term free will, right? He's using it as being... the way libertarian free will is often seen is in terms of contra-causal free will. In other words, it works against causality because there are no antecedent causes, supposedly, for a freely willed decision. The problem is, this looks identical to random. So if you're saying God didn't have anything determining, there was no antecedent, there's no previously determining causal factors into his decision, then his decision looks identical to random. In which case, the decision to create this universe was random. It just popped out of God. And there was no deliberation. There was no free choice in any sense of the term free choice. Man, Craig should have been absolutely hammered for this point, because that's just, not only is libertarian free will incoherent, but he's using it incoherently. Another layer of incoherence. Just, I mean, this is as far as I'm concerned, just plain nonsense.
So this is the problem I'm having, is you say he wills the universe into being at that moment. But how can we make sense of a term like at that moment if this being is timeless? Yeah. Because as you say, if it's an infinite being, the question is, if that cause is sufficient and infinite, then the effect should also be infinite, implying that there was no sufficiency up to a certain point. But how can you talk about points with no time?
This is a great question, and the question here you're raising is, which one is explanatorily prior? God's decision to create the world is simultaneous with the origin of the world. They're at the same moment, the first moment of time. So which is explanatorily prior? Is it the moment of time, and it is at that moment that God chooses? Or is it rather that God makes a free choice, and therefore that is the first moment of time? And I would say it's the latter. God's free choice is explanatorily prior to the existence of the first moment of time, because in the absence of some sort of an event, there would be no time. It would just be timelessness. You need something to happen in order for time to exist. And what happens is that God freely chooses to create the universe. So it's all about explanatory priority here.
Holy guacamole. Okay. So Craig is saying God's decision, that's literally what it says, God's decision to create is explanatorily prior to the creation of the world. Even though the creation of the world and God's decision is timeless. There's some kind of explanation. Absent of time, there's some kind of priority that is given to the decision leading to the creation, right? He asserts this. I can't make sense of that. I can't make sense of it. But I also can't make sense of the term decision. You cannot make a decision. A decision, so in any sense of the term that we use decision, when you say, oh, what decision did you make? You are saying that at one point you hadn't made the decision, and then at another point in time, something happened within your brain such that you decided to do something. A choice was made, and hopefully, if you believe in kind of rationality, then that decision was based upon some kind of calculation, and calculations take time, certainly with humans. So what this is saying is that in God's world, in timeless world, there was not a time where God had decided not to go, or hadn't made the decision to create, and then a subsequent time when God decided to create. There was just literally the decision to create. But there's no calculation, there's no deliberation, because there's no time. In other words, there just is creation. There isn't a decision. I can make absolutely no sense of the idea that God decided to do anything absent of time. You need time to decide, unless you are just bastardizing the use of the term, or bastardizing the term decision and decide. This is Craig arguably at his most incoherent in the whole discussion, and I think he needed to be nailed for this, because personality, personhood, decisions, free will, all of these don't make any sense without time. And therefore, to ascribe these properties to God in a timeless existence is nonsense.
So the insufficiency of the cause before, let's say, if it's the wrong language, but before the universe exists, the insufficiency of the cause, which means that it hasn't existed yet, is prior in explanation rather than prior in time.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that what you call the insufficiency of the cause is due to the fact that the free will of this being has not chosen to create the universe. This being has not made such a decision. But the instant that such a decision is made, time comes into being. Indeed.
What? The free will of this being has not chosen to make the universe, has not made a decision. But the instant that such a decision is made, I mean, this is a timeless existence. Come on, Craig, you're better than this. That's not an answer for how God can make a decision in a timeless existence, to use in entirely temporal language or stuff that depends on time. Man!
The decision is explanatorily prior to the first instant of time.
Yeah. When you say the free, it's because of the freedom of the being, and the free being hasn't made the decision. It feels like that it's begging for the word "yet" to be on the end of that. It hasn't made the decision yet.
I know.
You know, but it's
Yes,
like we're carefully avoiding that language because of the complications of time. But it seems like the explanation that you're giving, it feels to me like naturally it invokes a sense of time. I still don't quite see how it works without time.
Well, you just have to be very careful if you're going to be philosophically precise to use tenseless verbs in your sentences and not use temporal particles like before or yet and things of that sort. And I think that we can avoid those and make coherent statements. For example, I said, sans the universe, God exists timelessly. That's a tenseless verb. Sans the universe, God does not freely choose to create the universe. So I think that these statements can be correctly made if we just watch our tenses and our adverbs.
Sure. So I should say to the listeners, I'm going to leave resources and writings that Dr. Craig has made on these points, because there's no way you can get to the bottom of them in a podcast like this.
No, not sure. No, don't leave this. Craig needs to be absolutely taken to the cleaners on this point, and you know what a great discussion this is. But to leave this point there is it's such a crime, because his answer just then was like, no, we can use language. Look, I've just said some sentences without using temporal language. Therefore, God. I cannot believe how poor Craig just was. This is a fundamental weakness in his argument, and he was left absolutely hanging, and unfortunately he was left to get away with it. I mean, arguably, yeah, if you want to get onto other topics, and you've got to move on to other topics, but that kind of rush to move on to other topics means that on these very important, crucial points, Craig is allowed to just make some assertions and then not substantiate them. His argument fails on that. I mean, I've shown you hopefully how it fails on a lot of points, but just on this point, the entire Kalam fails as far as what he thinks it does and where he thinks it goes. So, I mean, I'm going to leave it here, but all I can say is that I think the Kalam is on far shakier ground than ever I thought, because actually it doesn't look like Craig has any arguments really to defend these criticisms. I mean, I put all these criticisms in my book, Did God Create the Universe from Nothing? Encountering William Lane Craig's Kalam Cosmological Argument. And actually, he's got no decent answers for them. So, I don't know. I'm quite amazed. But anyway, thanks to Alex for having this really stimulating conversation. Even if I think Craig was allowed to get away with a few really, really weak points. So there you go. I've got a bunch of merch. You know, you can buy mugs and t-shirts. That'd be great. Linked in the description. I've got loads of books, including that one. And please drop by my blog at A Tippling Philosopher on the Patheos Non-Religious channel. Again, link below. Anyway, take care. Question everything, apart from me. Until next time, goodbye, and thanks to CosmicSkeptic again.